morning, everyone. I'm Chelsea Burke. I'm a co-pastor here at the church along with Johnny Burke and Dawn Fox. And I have to say, if I'm a little distracted, it's because there's a whole lot of cuteness going on over there right now. I don't know if you can hear it. But their noises aren't distracting. I did see little Mia yawn a little while ago, and my whole heart melted. So I'm going to try not to focus over there. I'm going to try to include everybody. I'm excited to be able to share with you today. We've been talking a lot about the way that Jesus changes people. In the last couple of weeks, we talked about how Jesus changed Nicodemus, and then we talked about how Jesus changed Matthew. And today I am very excited to share with you about how Jesus changed the Samaritan woman. So how many of you in here have dogs? Anybody here have dogs? Okay, this is a dog-loving group. We right now do not have dogs because we can't, but we did, and we had 3 beautiful puppy dogs, and we love them very much. But how many of you have ever had to put a cone on your dog? Do that? Yeah. Well, we had one dog who felt the cone was her necklace and her beautiful hats, and she would be excited, and her little tail would wag, and she would walk around like she was the proudest puppy on the planet because she had a cone on her head. Now, I understand this isn't normal, so we had another dog who had to wear a cone, and we would end up calling it his cone of shame. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. You put the cone on him, and his little tail would just drop, and it would go down between his legs. His head would get real low, and he would just look at us like we were the worst people on the planet, because how could we do this to him? And so I was looking up, what does shame really mean? And so I looked it up, and it says, shame is defined as a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. For our dog, we cause that humiliation and that foolish behavior. But for people, it's a little bit different. And the woman that we're going to be talking about today, the Samaritan woman, shame was something that she lived in. And it was caused by her behavior. And we're going to take a look at how Jesus changed her, the Samaritan woman, from shamed to empowered. And really this happened in her journey. This journey of change happened in 3 steps. There was a part where Jesus was involved, and there's a part where she's involved. And that first step is she stayed. And to understand that, let's take a look at, we're going to be in John 4 today, and we're going to be looking right now at verses 4 through 9. And this is Jesus. He's having to leave Galilee, and he's going to be traveling down to Judea. It says he had to go through Samaria on the way. Eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please, give me a drink." He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. And the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And she said to Jesus, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" It seems simple. Here it is, they're having this conversation. He's asking for a drink. Why wouldn't she get him water? And she chose to stay in this conversation with him. She decided to respond to him. And it doesn't seem like very much at first, but we have to understand all the reasons that she could have left this conversation that would have just been acceptable for her to go. And it says in the verse that the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. Well, there's a reason for that. The Jews and the Samaritans had a really rocky, difficult relationship, and sometimes violent. So much so that the Jews would do anything they could to avoid going through Samaria. So if you can imagine with me on my imaginary map right here, you have Galilee here, Samaria is here, and Judea is here. The quickest route is to go straight through, and it's 70 miles. For us in a car, that's not too bad. Take about an hour maybe if you're driving 65. But for them, they're on foot, and they walk everywhere they go. And so to get from point A to point B, it would take about 2.5 days to make this journey. And so the Jews were so resistant to the Samaritans that they would go way out of their way and add time to walk to where they were getting to go. The reason that the relationship was so rocky was really 2 reasons. The first had to do with ethnicity, because the Jews felt that the Samaritans had no connection to God. They were not a part of God's people. They didn't descend from that, and they had no right to claim it because they were God's chosen people and the Samaritans were not. The Samaritans did not agree with this. They felt that they descended from 2 of the tribes, from the 12 tribes. If you remember, we've been going through the one-year Bible, and we've been reading about, Genesis and all through that. And we heard about Jacob, who was called Israel, and he had a son named Joseph, and Joseph had 11 other brothers, and those brothers really didn't like him, so much so that they ended up selling him into slavery, right? That's not a nice thing to do. And they told his father he had been killed. And so he goes down, but God had this great plan, and he uses him to be able to store up food and to be able to take care of everyone, including Jacob and all of the sons. Well, when they come and they reunite, they find out that Joseph had 2 sons. And I'm going to say these names, and I want to apologize if I butcher them. But it's Ephraim and Manasseh. It's really hard for me to say. And so these 2 sons, Jacob decided to adopt himself. And so then they lived in Egypt, and then they became enslaved. And then Moses frees all of the people from Egypt, and he brings them out. And they name the 12 tribes after all of his sons, including Ephraim and Manasseh. And this is who the Samaritans believe they are descended from. And they believe they are very much connected to God's people. So this would be a huge point of contention for anyone. Somebody's telling you, no, you're not related to that person. You don't come from there. That's not where you are. It's going to cause tension. But the second part that causes tension is they disagreed greatly on where worship was supposed to be held. The Jews understood worship was to be held in the temple, that it was the temple in Jerusalem, and that's where you go, and that is where you worship. But the Samaritans did not believe that, because the Samaritans had a version of a book called the Pentateuch, which is really just the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. And that's where they got all of their information from, and it was their version of it. They called it the Samaritan Pentateuch. And so in their version, they understood that you worshiped on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And the reason that they felt that was that this is where Moses came with the tribes, and where they settled, and where God gave the rules, where some of the first sacrifices were held. This mountain was the mountain that God said, this is where blessings will be held. And so they felt very strongly that this is where you worship from. And it has to be this way, because they didn't believe in anything the prophets had to say or any of the other writings. It was just these 5 books. So this was a heated discussion because they both felt the other was so wrong. So on this level alone, when the Samaritan woman saw Jesus, she would have understood he was Jewish by the clothes that he was wearing and by the way that he spoke. Kind of like if we know somebody from the South comes up and they have that accent, we're going to know, okay, that's where they're from. But she knew by the way that he was clothed and the way that he spoke that he was Jewish. And so on that, it would have been understandable for her to just be able to leave this conversation and walk away. The second reason that she could have just walked away from this conversation was it was culturally unacceptable for both Jews and Samaritans for a man and a woman who are not married to be somewhere holding a conversation alone. And if we take a look in verse 27, I'll skip ahead a little bit, we're going to see when the disciples return their actual reaction to this issue. It says in verse 27, just then his disciples came back, and they were shocked to find him talking to a woman. But none of them had the nerve to ask, what do you want with her? Or why are you talking to her? This was really a big no-no in the culture. And so for that alone, she could have just turned around from this conversation and gone home and not dealt with him. But she stayed. The third reason she could have turned around and stayed and not engaged in this conversation is the reason that she is shamed in the first place. And again, we're going to jump ahead a little bit in the verse to take a look. We're going to go to verses 16 through 18. And Jesus says to her, go and get your husband. He says, I don't have a husband, the woman replied. And Jesus said, you're right, you don't have a husband. For you have 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with. You certainly spoke the truth. See, the Samaritans would be considered a very conservative group, and they held very tightly to those laws that God gave on the mountain to Moses. In Exodus 22, one of the laws stated that if a man was with a woman who was a virgin and unmarried, and he was with her sexually, that he had to pay a fine and then he had to marry her if the father approved. So this woman is living in a home with a man like she's married, but she's not married. And And this is where the shame comes in. She's going to this well at noontime for a reason. Going to the well at noon is not a convenient time. It's hot. You got to carry the water. It's just really unpleasant. It's uncomfortable. But for her, she would rather endure the physical uncomfortableness of going to this well than to go at the popular times when it's a little bit cooler and deal with the emotional stress of it. Now, it doesn't say, the verse doesn't tell us, people made fun of her or they said this, but you can imagine for her to avoid going to the well at the convenient times of day, to go when it's physically uncomfortable, meant she didn't want to be around them, and she was hiding and she was feeling shamed. All of these reasons were really good reasons that she could have just seen Jesus, and as he began to speak, turn around and just take off. But she didn't. She stayed. He invited her into that conversation. And even if her response is a little snippy when she comes back saying, I'm a Samaritan, why are you asking me for water? She is engaging with him. We watch a lot of cartoons in my house. That will tell you a lot of cartoons. And so sometimes I got to bring a new one in because I can't watch the same one for the 50th time in a row. And so I brought a new one into our house, and I sat down with Corey to watch it. And it was one that I watched. And it's the cartoon Beauty and the Beast. And so we're sitting there and we're watching it. And Corey, who's very inquisitive and very smart, picked up on something I never picked on before. She goes, Mom, why is the beast so angry? And I thought, well, that's a really good question. Why is he so angry? And I started to think about it. And if you've ever seen it, the beginning of it is this handsome man who rules his kingdom. And there's a knock on his door. And he comes to the door, and standing before him is a woman who he doesn't find visually appealing. She doesn't have a lot of money. She's asking for help. She's needy. And he decides, you know what? This is not the person I want in my kingdom. And so he turns her away. Well, she curses him, and she turns him into this beast, and turns all the furniture and everybody into utensils and furniture and all of that fun stuff. But she turns him into this beast. And the scene that Corey is talking about, they're panning through his bedroom, and he has cut the picture of his old self, and his room is trashed, and he is angry, and he is yelling. And I looked at her and I said, Corey, he's angry because he's ashamed. He's ashamed of the choices that he made, of the way that he looks, of where he's at. And everybody, he has hidden himself from him. He doesn't want to be around anybody who could possibly look at him, because he doesn't believe anybody could ever look at him and see him as something any more than a beast. This is our woman. She feels shamed. There's nothing more that she can feel than shamed. And Jesus has invited her into a conversation with him. He has seen past that, and he wants to talk to her. But she had to make the choice to stay in that conversation. We have to make that choice to stay in that conversation. Whether it's good, sometimes that's a little easier to go hold that conversation. But when things are bad, God is inviting us into that conversation with him. He wants us to pray and be there with him. Now, she stayed and she accepted that invitation. The second part of her journey into change is because she thirsts. And so if we take a look at John 4:19 through 25, it says, I might have skipped ahead. 10 through 15, I apologize. So 10:15. So this is after he has asked her for a drink of water, and she said, why are you asking me for a drink? I'm just a Samaritan woman. And Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. But sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket, she said, and the well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again, but those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Amen. Please, sir, the woman said, give me this water, then I will never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water. So she engaged him. And then he starts to tell her, and he gives her a little bit of information. And he starts to talk about this living water versus water. The living water he's talking about is salvation. To be forgiven, to be set free. But she doesn't understand that to start with. And we see that because she says, where's your bucket? Where are you going to get this water from? Here's this well, it's really deep. Why are you talking about, you didn't even have that. How are you going to give this to me? And in that, he begins to teach her a little bit more. And he's patient and he's kind, even though some of her questions are harsh and direct, but he's there. And he says to her, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. He's addressing, it's not this water. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again, because I become a fresh bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. And she's, please give this to me. I want this. She says, because then I never have to come to this well again. Why wouldn't she want to come to the well again? Because she's still dealing with the shame. And she's not understanding that he's saying, you can be forgiven and you will be set free and you will live in me. And she's amazed. And then they go into this discussion where, she's asked this, she's kind of starting to move along and get this. And that's when Jesus comes in and says, go get your husband. And we pick up after that because she's honest. She says, I don't have a husband. And he's like, you're right. You don't. You have 5. And you're living with one you're not married with. You certainly spoke the truth. And then we pick up in 19 through 25. It says, Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here on Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worship? Jesus replied, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. For salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is the Spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit. So you catch the part right after where she says, you must be a prophet. He has just given her information he should not know. He doesn't know her. They've never met. He's traveling from another city. He's coming through a town he hasn't been through before. There's no possible way that he could know. Maybe he could have heard along the way that she's living with someone unmarried, but he knows she's been married 5 times. There's no way he could have gotten that information unless God gave it to him. And so for her, she calls him a prophet. She is recognizing you are more than just some teacher of the law. You know things and it's inspired by God. Like, this is amazing. How could this be? So what does she do? You could say maybe she disregarded what information he was telling her and she was like, let's just move on to this subject. But she goes on to ask the question that has separated the Jews and the Samaritans for so long, and it's created hostility and anger. She's asking, where's the right place to worship? Like, really, the Jews say over here, we say over here. Where is it really? And his first response is, doesn't matter. It's not going to matter anymore. But then he does answer her honestly. The Jews have had it right. You haven't. But again, it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter anymore because he's explaining that he is coming to change the way worship is going to be held. It is no longer going to matter where the place is. It matters about a heart issue. We sang today in Amazing Love, I'm forgiven because you were forsaken. I'm accepted because you were condemned. Your spirit is within me because you died and rose again. This is what he is trying to teach her. The worship is going to be about our heart. It's going to be about who you believe. It's not going to matter where you are. And her response to that, because he is so patient and he is so kind and he is walking her through this, her response says, the woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus tells her, I am the Messiah. So he has led her to this. He's slowly taking her at her pace to understand, and she is thirsting for more information and more information. And what's really neat about him being so direct, he wasn't able to do this in the Jewish community, to be so direct and say, I am the Messiah. When his disciples, they held this conversation in Matthew 22, Peter's there, and Jesus asked Peter, he says, who am I? And Peter's like, you're the Messiah. Jesus says, yes. And then this is what he says. Then he sternly warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Because in the Jewish community, they had already had this image and this idea of who the Messiah was going to be, and so it was a bit dangerous to be able to bring that out just yet. But he's in Samaria, and they didn't listen to the prophets' writings. They didn't listen to any of that. So their image is not the same. So he is very freely able to say to her, I am the Messiah. And so he has explained this plainly. He taught at her level, and it made her thirst for more. She wanted more knowledge. I'll admit, when I was in grade school and high school, I was a terrible student. Not from a lack of effort, but because it was very, very hard. By the time I got to my senior year in high school, I had switched schools because I wasn't happy with the one that I was at. And I went into a new school, and oh my goodness, I thought it was the worst choice I'd ever made in my life because I couldn't do the work. And my teachers got together with my parents and said, something is not right. We got to do something else. So they decided to send me to a special learning center called Sylvan Learning Center. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. And so we went in, and it was miserable for me, I'll be honest, because I'm like, it's our break. I have to go to school. You know, I'm supposed to be relaxing. I don't like doing any of the schoolwork anyway because it's too difficult. And they went in and they had me sit down, and they did testing for hours. And if you don't like schoolwork anyway, going and just taking a test for fun for 3 hours is not your idea of fun. After the test, we all came together in the room. They had my parents, they had me, and them. And they sat down and they explained, yes, you're having difficulty learning. The reason is you can't connect what you read to your head with pictures. So you aren't understanding what you're reading. You never learned how to do that. And so they explained this plan that they were going to help me do this. Well, I'll tell you, when they brought out the first baby book, when you're 17 years old and you're going to have to read a baby book to try and get pictures to connect, I thought, you people are crazy. Like, this is not going to work, and I don't want to do this. But the person who was teaching was so kind. They were like, trust me. We understand how hard this is. We understand you don't get it, but it's a process, and I'll walk you through it. And when you get to the end, it's going to be worth it. I'd like to say they said it once, and I was like, okay, this is good. But we fought a lot during the way. Like, really, I had to keep doing this. And we moved up to children's books and up and up. At the end of that month, I read my very first novel of my entire life, and it was The Diary of Anne Frank, and I understood what I read. And it was the most amazing moment of my life, sitting there, learning how to read up to that point, because I had avoided it so much. They had given me a thirst to read more. And now I love to read. Like, I don't want to put books down. I love it so much. It's still not the easiest thing, but I have the skills and the ability to do it now. And I understand why it's hard. And so I put in the extra effort. But they gave me the tools because they sat patiently and they increased my thirst. Jesus did this for the Samaritan woman. He walked at her level, he took her through it, and he gave her information and helped her begin to think it through. And he increased her thirst. Who is this? Why is he still talking to me? I mean, this is amazing. Who is this man? Jesus does that for us if we go to him. We can go to him in prayer and read our Bibles, and we can lean on him because he is our teacher and our guide as we walk through things. Just like that person sat with me to help me learn to read better, he is there to sit with us through whatever's going on, good or bad. He is there, and he wants to guide us, and he's going to work at our level. So if we look at somebody else and think, gosh, he's doing so much over there, he is doing it with you too. You're just doing it at different times and in different ways. The third step in her journey of change was that she told. If we take a look at verses 27 through 30, it says, just then his disciples came back, They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, "What do you want with her?" or "Why are you talking to her?" The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah?" So the people came streaming from the village to see him. When you look at it, those disciples show up, and this effectively ends the conversation between the woman and Jesus. They had been alone, he was teaching, she was growing, she was changing, and then they show up. And I have to ask myself, what was the look on their faces when they said, because it says they were shocked. Now, my 6-year-old is learning how to control what she says, and so that not everything that comes into her head needs to be said. But if you've ever looked at her when she's in one of those moments, you can guess what she said by the look on her face. And I wonder, was that the way the disciples were? Were we wondering, was it pretty clear to her? Was she dealing with that shame again when she turned around and left? I don't believe that's true. Because when we take a look, she left her water jug behind. Back then, that water jug was so important. They couldn't just go turn water on in their house. That water was what they would have. And if they needed more, they'd have to go back to that well. She didn't want to be around the people, so she was still dealing with shame. Would she have forgotten the most important, essential thing that was with her? The second thing is it didn't say she went home and thought about what Jesus said. No. She went and she told. She went into the town and she said, "Come and see. Come look at this man who told me everything I ever did." Now, this conversation that her and Jesus had didn't last for hours. We know that the disciples went to get food for Jesus for the travel, and he was sitting at the well resting. So it was from whatever time that they were left away from him and the time that they would have bought food and come back, that these two are having this conversation at well. And then as soon as the disciples come, she departs. But where did she go? She went directly into town where just a little bit before, she was hiding from those people. She was hiding from them for the shame that she had. And now she is running to them and telling them, "He's told me everything I ever did in my life." And she's not prisoner of that shame anymore. She's been set free because she's willing to talk about it. He has empowered her. But to see that empowerment even more, if we go on down a little further to verses 39 through 42, it says, "Many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, 'He told me everything I ever did.' When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in their village. So he stayed for 2 days, long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. Then they said to the woman, 'Now we believe not just because of what you told us, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world.'" She was sharing it all. She was not hiding anymore. Her shame was out there. But her empowerment, we can see in their reaction. Have you ever held a conversation with somebody maybe you didn't respect or you didn't trust? How well do you listen in those conversations? You're constantly thinking, is that true? Is that right? They're listening to her. They are hearing her. She is sharing her story, and their belief isn't just, "Gosh, that's great news for you. Way to go." They said, "We're going to go find him. We're going to go right now because what you have said and what you have shared, we have got to know more about this." Her story was empowered. And not only did they go and listen, she still went right back with them. She wanted to be there listening. I'd like to say I know for sure she believed. I think in every bit of my heart that she did. It doesn't say, but so many more came to believe because she was empowered and she went and she told. It's funny, a lot of the encounters we read about Jesus, people cannot keep quiet about him. They just can't. And there's one in Mark chapter 1, 40 through 45, and I'll want to read it to you today. It says, "A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. 'If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean,' he said. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be healed.' Instantly, the leprosy disappeared and the man was healed. Then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest, let him examine you, take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. But the man went and he spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. And as a result, large crowds soon began surrounding Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anymore. But isn't that true? He was so excited. He just healed me of everything. Like, I can understand that. It would just be bursting from me. I'd want to go tell everyone. But it's this thing that Jesus does when he changes you. You are empowered and you want to go tell. And just as the Samaritan woman was changed by Jesus, she went from shame to empowered. She had to go tell. We get to go tell too. So he changed her from shame to empowered. And it took 3 steps. It took her involvement. It takes our involvement for that change to happen. The first step is she stayed. He invited her into that conversation. She stayed. She was willing to partake in it. We can partake in that conversation. We are invited into that conversation always. We just have to go in prayer. Then she thirsted. She wanted to know more. He was teaching and she just wanted more and kept wanting more and thirsted and thirsted and thirsted. And we can do that too. We get into our Bibles, we listen to him, we talk to them, and our thirst will grow and he will teach. And lastly, she told, which is so exciting. She went and told because she could have gone home and not told, but she did. She went, she told, she showed her change by going and telling others. She was no longer held prisoner by what had held her prisoner before, by that shame. Instead, she was empowered by that very same story. That story that held her down now lifted her up. And because she told, she was able to change others. And Christ wants us to tell our story. Our stories are empowering. Your stories and your stories, everybody's stories, all of us, our story has power in it. God has worked in all of us. He released her of that shame that was keeping her hidden. We can be released of whatever it is. That's right. What is going on right now? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it grief? Is it shame? All of that, Jesus can change when we go to him. He empowers us to tell our story just as he empowered her. So I challenge you this week. I challenge you to go out and tell your story. Somebody needs to hear it. Just like the Samaritan woman told her story, and some came and listened to Jesus, and that brought in more, and that brought in more. Your story affects somebody else, just as mine will and yours will. We have to share our story. So I challenge you to go and share your story this week. But if you are in the middle of the process of change, come and find somebody in here and start to share that story and hear theirs. And you will bring change to other people.